Right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second matter to hearing session, and that's concerning accommodation for gypsies, travellers, travelling show people and boat dwellers. Can people hear me? If you can perhaps just thumbs up or whatever, that's great. Thank you very much. Hello to those who I saw in person back in the district back in June. Hello again to you, and hello to the new people. Just in case you don't know, for those who haven't met me before, my name's Malcolm Rivet. I'm one of the two inspectors appointed to examine the plan. Just to remind you, as I think you're already aware, this hearing is being live streamed to YouTube. If anybody makes their own recording of it, please ensure that you comply with the law if you then choose to distribute or publish it. I'll set out in a second some context for the discussion today, and just to let you know, I think things might be a bit different to they might have been, or how I thought they might have been earlier in the week, but I'll come on to that in a second. But just before we do that, can I ask everybody just to briefly introduce themselves? So starting for the council.
Thank you, sir. My name is Michael Bedford, Queen's Counsel, instructed by the councils to assist them with legal support during the local plan examination. And also with me is Mr. Hobbs, the Strategic Planning Manager, who you've obviously heard from before, and also Mr. Nigel Doyle, one of the enforcement team, who again I think you heard from back in June.
Okay, thank you. And then the others, start with Mr. Hargreaves.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Hargreaves. I'm a town planner with over 20 years local government experience. I was then a civil servant working on planning policy. In that role, I piloted the East of England Regional Strategy, Gypsy and Traveller Review through to adoption by ministers. In 2010, I left the civil service and was doing some policy and research work related mainly to gypsies and travellers. And since 2013, I've kind of established a tiny consultancy working exclusively on gypsy and traveller issues. My client, Martin Doherty, is a traveller of mixed Irish, Romani, gypsy background and a local businessman. Unfortunately, for various reasons, Martin isn't able to be here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Carruthers.
I'm Stuart Crothers. I've worked extensively in local government and with central government. I'm a former European Commission functionaire. I fell into acting for gypsy travellers in about 2002 by mistake. I now provide consultancy services in town planning to quite a large number of them. And I'm here representing about 15 families who are listed in my statement that I've made. Okay. And have been involved with Mid Suffolk for a number of years, particularly since 2011.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Fisk.
Yes, good morning. My name is David Fisk. I'm just a member of the public and part of a group who's campaigning to clean up Pin Mill for many years without. I'm still trying. I'm a sole person here.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. So I don't know if any of you saw the hearing sessions live streamed yesterday, or the live stream of the hearing sessions yesterday. As a result of that, the council has decided it needs to go away and do some significant work on some fundamental aspects of the plan, the overall spatial strategy and the site selection process. Well, they're going to be putting together a sort of programme of that work for consideration by me and my colleague in the next few weeks. And it's anticipated that that work would take probably at least at least 6 months, potentially more. And so the plan would not be anywhere towards nearing adoption, for at least that time. Probably you're talking realistically a year or so from now. So that obviously changes things from where we were at the beginning of the week, and certainly where we were when we had the discussion back in June, which was on the very first day of the hearings, about gypsies and travellers. I will deal with gypsies and travellers first, policy LP09, and then come on later, we'll talk about LP10 in terms of boat dwellers. So that's the order I'll take it in. I suppose to say that the point where we'd left it back in June was I'd indicated concerns that the plan hadn't identified sites for gypsies to meet the identified needs for gypsies and travellers, and I put it to the council that a plan needed to do that, or well, ideally it needed to do that, or possibly it might be sound to pragmatically conclude that a very positive development management policy to enable applications to come forward and be approved would be necessary as a possible sort of less than ideal alternative, but that policy would need to be much less restrictive than the one that was currently in the plan LP09. That's in effect where we left it at that stage, and I think the council at that time's preference was very much to go for the latter of the policy. And I've had some thoughts over the interim months. I've had some thoughts as to the wording of such a policy, which actually probably be fairly very short and brief. However, that was on the basis of that we had a plan that was, otherwise likely to be fundamentally okay and wasn't going to require any massive sort of evidence collection work, and would be likely to be in a position to be hopefully adopted within a matter of months. We're not now in that situation. So what I think the appropriate position is in terms of that issue is, I think the council needs to go away and consider again the potential to allocate sites. The work that's going on elsewhere will be considering the need potentially, or the appropriateness in the light of the evidence as to whether different sites for housing for the settled community need to be allocated. So I think that there is certainly the time to now consider whether sites for gypsies and travellers and travelling show people should be allocated within the plan to meet the needs. I can't be prescriptive at this stage. I mean, in the end, it needs to be for the council, as I indicated yesterday, it needs to be for the council to go away and consider what approach it wishes to adopt, and for then that to come back to us as the inspectors for us to decide whether or not that is a sound approach. It's not for us in these circumstances now to sort of dictate which way you would go, other than I would say national policy is very clear that the starting point is you allocate sites to meet your need for gypsies and travellers and travelling show people accommodation in the way that you should do with housing for the settled community. So that's all I would say. But beyond that, I think it's for the council to go away and consider what approach it intends or wishes to take on that. The other aspect of this is the needs assessment, which has been the subject of significant criticism. we had quite a long discussion on that back in June. The council, at my request at that, has gone away and responded in writing in detail to most of the points of the criticism, and I've then since seen Mr. Hargreaves and Mr. Carruthers' comments on those comments type of thing and further thoughts. I think we could, as the points currently stand at this second, based on that written evidence, my thoughts are inconclusive at the moment. We could spend a lot of time today discussing all the pros and cons of all that, but actually I think something else comes into play, which means that would probably be not fruitful of anybody's time, because a point that I pointed out back in June was that the needs assessment is nearing 5 years old anyway, and very clearly at the end of the needs assessment it says it needs to be updated in a period of 5 to 7 years. Now, obviously, we're approaching the 5 years. Whilst it might have been appropriate, subject to me being satisfied that it was basically fit for purpose, it might have been appropriate to say, right, well, we've got a plan here that's nearing the point of adoption. It makes sense to go ahead on the basis of this needs assessment with potentially an early review of that needs assessment, and then update of the plan if necessary to take account of an updated needs assessment. I think we're in a different situation now that since the council's going away to do 6 months work or more, I think we're in a different situation. And I would be, again, it's got to be for the council to decide what it wants to do in the first instance, and for us as inspectors to decide what the sound approach is. But I would now be urging the council to go away and consider whether or not a sort of update of the needs assessment or revision of it is necessary. I appreciate there is a complication to that, and that's why I'm saying the council needs to consider this, because I appreciate there's a complication to that, which this document isn't for these 2 districts alone. It covers partners as well, and whilst in theory the 2 districts could go away and do something for themselves, just for themselves, and update for themselves, that it doesn't necessarily make sense, and the desirability of it is that ongoing joint work with neighbours is continued. So I think the council needs to have discussions with the neighbouring authorities about this, as about the appropriate time for an update of that guidance, who's involved in that, how long that might take, and how that feeds into what these districts, the 2 districts here, are going to do for that joint plan. So I think there's quite a bit of discussion that needs to go on there, but I think the council needs to have those thoughts, those discussions, and then come back saying what it's going to do in the context. But I think it's important for me to say that now, because what I don't want to happen, and not that it is no thought to be given to any of this, for the council to come back with all their other work in 6-9 months time. There will clearly need to be, and potentially, if they've looked at allocating sites to meet numbers which are approaching 5 years old, and for me at that stage to say, and others at that stage to say, well, hang on, all very interesting, but this is meeting the need. This plan is meeting the needs of an assessment that's 5 years old. So that's where we are on that. That's my thinking as to the way forward. So that's very different to how I imagine this session would go earlier in the week, but hopefully that makes sense in terms of where we are. Clearly, before the plan were to be adopted, and we're a long way from that, there would need to be yet a further session on Gypsies and Travellers to consider at that point, at the point at which we've got what the council are proposing, to consider at that point what they're proposing in relation to Gypsies and Travellers. There would need to be consultation on that, and then a hearing to discuss whether or not that's sound. So basically, in effect, saying that at this point there is little point in discussing in detail LP09 further at this stage. Can I just, before I open it up to the others, can I just turn to the council on that? Are you any comments on that as a suggested way forward at this stage for you to go away, consider those points, and come back in your sort of detailed proposal of what you're proposing to do on the other work to include your thoughts on where you see going on Gypsies and Travellers?
So yes, thank you. Well, that is helpful to have those matters sort of clearly set out, and as you rightly say, the hiatus for other reasons does provide some opportunity to look at things in a different way to how we might have been looking at matters previously. I think one thing that we would say is that it probably makes sense to continue to keep separate as strands of as it were, activity, the question of allocations and whether that's an appropriate solution at this stage, and the question of update to the needs assessment, keeping them separate for this reason. Well, whilst, as it were, you might say that in an ideal world that was unconstrained by any other considerations, you would do an updated needs assessment first, and then you would use that to inform the scale of need that you were looking for, and then that would inform any kind of site search exercise and so on and so forth, because that would be, in a sense, the ideal. I think the practical position that we're in is, as you rightly recognise, that one issue about a needs assessment is, should it be solus or should it be joint, which involves engaging with our partner authorities, and it wouldn't be, I think, fruitful given that whilst there is a hiatus, it's not an open-ended hiatus. It wouldn't be fruitful to delay contemplating the issues about allocations so that wasn't considered until after there was an updated ANA in place, because that might not fit into the overall wider timetable. I say that's why I say we think it probably makes sense to keep the two strands separate, so that what we were contemplating doing was giving careful consideration to the practicability of whether there is scope, as it were, almost on an interim basis, to contemplate in this plan making allocations, potentially using publicly owned land as it were, a first source, because obviously there's a land ownership issue which may make deliverability more straightforward than, as it were, a more open sort of call for sites and then a complete site search exercise. But keeping that as one strand, and therefore something which may be easier to then dovetail into any further work that is being done on site selection and sustainability appraisal. So that's something that, in a sense, could potentially slot into the work that we were envisaging, obviously, as discussed yesterday. Obviously, there would also still need to be the question of consultation and so on and so forth on that. But that if that strand, which effectively our thinking on that can progress, as it were, almost immediately, and then depending on what view is taken about that, that can begin to be put in train. But then separately, the question of a wider update of the ANA, and obviously dialogue with partners and so on. It may be, and I don't know at this stage, it may be that the output from such an exercise could emerge in time to inform the next stages of the plan, but it may be that it doesn't. And I say I think it's probably helpful to keep them as separate. And therefore that's I think that's our current thinking. And I say we certainly know what you said, and obviously we're aware of what the national policy advice is, and obviously the preference clearly for allocations to meet identified needs if that is practicable. But obviously a default position may need to be a robust criteria-based policy, which is a policy which is permissive rather than a policy which is simply a hurdle to, as it were, preclude delivery. I think we just need to reflect on that, because clearly there are challenges, as I'm sure you're well aware, with an allocations route, as well as there are challenges with a criteria-based policy route. But so we'll reflect on that. I say we do need to have that wider engagement with our partner authorities in relation to the ANA and the appropriate resource to ensure that if that were done, the timing of it and the resourcing of it, and I say if we take those away, as we obviously indicated yesterday, we're going to write to you as soon as practicable with our thoughts on the other work streams in relation to the matters that were being discussed about the spatial strategy and the site allocation process. And as you say, you don't want this, as it were, just to disappear into the ether. I think it would be sensible if our letter to you then sets out what our proposals are, having had that reflection, so that we're covering.
We need a proposal that sets out everything that needs doing. That's absolutely fine, and I understand that. I think the only thing I would say again, and perhaps a further thought, is I appreciate both the desirability of and the potential timescales and difficulty of a joint approach on a needs assessment. So I do appreciate that, but equally, we're here at this point now with people challenging the needs assessment, and it being nearing what the assessment itself says is its sort of life expiry, or in not life, that's a bit of an unfair word, but its need for a review. In 9 months' time, a year or whatever, we will be even closer to that. And I just warn against thinking, oh, it'll all be fine. When it's further down the line. One further thought then that leads me on to is there is a midway of maybe some, whilst not an entirely separate update or a complete update separate for Baber and Mid Suffolk, is something that looks at Baber and Mid Suffolk as a sort of mini update type of thing, pending a wider review. So you remain part of this joint thing, but there is a mini update for the two districts reflecting the fact that you're in an examination, but the document is quite old. So I think that's another option. And I noticed Mr. Hargreaves nodding his head there. And what I would urge the council to do is to perhaps discuss the potential for that and what format that might take with Mr. Hargreaves and Mr. Carruthers, because ultimately these are the people who are likely to be challenging with. I mean, I say I haven't reached conclusions on what either of them have said there, or your sort of your response to that. I haven't reached conclusions on that, but the comments made are sensible and potentially credible ones. Let me put it that way, if you see what I mean. These aren't things that I'm thinking, well, the comments made have got absolutely no, no basis or credibility in them. I haven't concluded one way or the other. So, but so I think it's important that you have those discussions, because ultimately, if you choose to if you end up with the position that we're sticking with the original needs assessment with no update of it at all, the same points that Mr. Hargreaves and Mr. Carruthers are already making in writing, and probably we're hopeful they could come here today and talk about in detail, will still be being made again. And at that point, I will have to reach a view on them. So I would encourage talk with them. That's all I would say. Mr. Hargreaves and Mr. Carruthers, I appreciate this puts you in a different position. You were probably, well, maybe you were looking forward to coming here today to be able to talk in detail again about your concerns. Maybe you weren't looking forward to having to talk in detail about them. But I hope you understand that actually talking in detail about those points now is just of no benefit to anybody at the moment at this point. Although, as I've said and made clear, I do hope the council will engage with you over the coming months. Is there anything that either would you would like to just say at this point, though, on that, Mr. Hargreaves? You need to be.
Thank you, Inspector. Couple of points. Firstly, on allocations, right? My experience suggests that I would be cautious about the effectiveness of a strategy which is based on local authorities bringing forward sites or through negotiation over major developments. It's because often of local political opposition and stuff to council promoted sites. It proves the record is that it's very difficult for councils to consistently promote and ensure the delivery of new traveller sites. The corollary of that is that the very, very large majority of sites that are delivered through the ownership of travellers themselves. Now, what that then means for this process is that if we're going to be allocating, identifying sites, in my view, it's essential, and Stuart Carruthers may want to come in and support this or not, that there is a call for sites which will allow those working on behalf of Gypsies and travellers to propose specific sites as suitable for allocation. That's my first point. I think the second point is because, following the additional information on site availability and Mr. Carruthers' evidence, it's very clear that the level of unmet need is significantly higher than the emerging plan suggests. And it seems to me to get a decent handle on the level of need is a priority for this plan to be made sound in regard to provision for Gypsies and travellers. Right now, I think I did nod, Inspector, at your suggestion of a middle way. Right, I can see the complications about getting 5 or 6 districts, some ahead of their timetable, to commit to a full review. It does seem to me, this is for the councils very much in liaison with their consultants. But remember, the RRR needs assessment from 2017 was a new exercise with a different methodology. The nature of that methodology, which is explained at pages 68 to 74 of the needs assessment, means that actually it can relatively easily be updated, adding in more recent data. And so I would be very disappointed, and I think the community would be failed if a decision is not taken to at least have do that local updating. I mean, it's obviously up to the council, but I would encourage them. It seems to me the method, the RRR methodology, is relatively easily updated compared with a completely new assessment. And I would strongly advocate that as being a pragmatic way forward to get us to a point where we have a reasonably sound database. Now, I think then the third point I would make is that any needs assessment, and not least this one, involves the use. It's not, the needs assessments are not objective. As well as data, they involve assumptions, and assumptions about how you project the data forward. There's a lot of room for different opinions about how you do that. On that basis, I would urge the inspectors respectfully to look for a technical seminar as part of the process. It might be that we have a session on gypsies and travellers, but a couple of hours of a technical seminar examining the findings of the updated needs assessment and the assumptions which underpin it would, I think, help us get to a point where we have a sound database for this area and to sort of addressing the critical shortage of accommodation for gypsy people. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm not going to ask the council to sort of comment on that, because, as I said before, it's now for the council to go away and decide what it thinks the appropriate approach is, and for then us as inspectors to comment on that. So I don't want them to have to sort of prejudice their position in any way, other than I would say, please do take account of what you've just heard. But Mr. Carruthers, have you got anything additional to add? Yep.
Inspector, I've got a number of issues with the council's proposals. The first is I'd like to know what issues the council is addressing underneath site selection and sustainability appraisal. I'm aware that the Environment Agency has produced a hydrographic survey covering around about 5 local authorities that identifies that very large areas are no longer suitable for development. I'm also aware of the fact that the LiDAR tails and the ordnance tables and the ordnance survey maps don't match. And the validity of the Environment Agency's input appears to be suspect at the moment. The Environment Agency is currently examining these issues. However, it does take an awful lot of land out of development, and it affects 5 local authorities. And my understanding is around about 15,000 housing allocations going along the Waveney Valley. Now, the second issue I've got, because I agree very strongly with Mr. Hargreaves about the need for a good database and a good data set. Mid Suffolk doesn't maintain its enforcement and stop notice register properly. That needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. That's in my submission to you. You've got examples of it. It's not publicly available. You have to go and sit on a table watching a computer screen at the moment. At least it has what it claims to be an enforcement and stop notice register. However, if you do look at the enforcement and stop notice register, the council should have been aware that it had a much higher level of gypsy traveller need in the district than it was allocating, than its consultants came up with. It also needs to look very, very hard at its caravan site licensing. The council removed all of the gypsy traveller sites from the caravan site licenses, and I know that most of them are already licensed. The issue that comes up with it is non-nomadic and nomadic gypsies. Now, the non-nomadic gypsies should be falling underneath the main housing allocations for site selection and sustainability appraisal. And the council's proposals appear to be, and this is sort of like having spoken with a number of the landowners, that people are evicted from their homes. if they don't meet the definition, the 2015 definition of nomadic gypsy, because the council claimed they'd made an allocation for them. Now, that appears to me to be very wrong. We've been through this with the council previously, and the Secretary of State came to the conclusion it was an abuse of human rights. Now, the council needs very strongly to separate out the non-nomadic gypsies and the nomadic gypsies, and make the provision underneath the different allocations. So I can't see how the gypsy allocation can be separated from the site selection and sustainability appraisal, because at least a very large proportion of those affected are going to fall within that allocation. So there's a whole lot of misapplication. I'm also aware that some councils are currently proposing that static caravan parks used for holiday use are now taken into housing. So there is a lot of examination needed, or consideration and reflection needed by the council on the non-nomadic gypsy question. And I think that needs to be done as a matter of urgency. My personal preference is that they go for an allocations policy. I've explained this to Mr. Hargreaves and to yourself, sir. And the reason for that is I'm aware of the fact it causes great political difficulties for the councils involved. Every council I'm aware of that's adopted an allocations policy, there's been a change in political control, and they've then adopted a much more sensitive approach towards a criteria-based policy. And my take on it is that probably Mid-Suffolk need to have an allocations policy. But they definitely need to go and get their register straight so that there can be trust and confidence in the council's data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Crothers there sort of reminded us all of an important point, which is the non-nomadic gypsies and travellers. I did raise that back in June as a question, and perhaps that's partly my fault, has been forgotten along the line. So it is important that the council also gives consideration to that and how that particular thing is dealt with. Okay, I think that probably covers us on LPO 9. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves and Mr. Crothers, for your contribution. And as I say, I urge the council to liaise with you, and no doubt we will. Well, actually, it would be nice to think we're not meeting again, because it would be nice to think that the council comes up with an approach which you both are supportive of, and you have no need to appear at a hearing at. But we'll see. So thank you very much for that. You're welcome to stay or leave as you see fit. We'll now move to matter LP10, moorings for boat dwellers. So we had quite a long discussion back in June. Mr. Fisk gave us a lot of detail as to his concerns as to why the moorings at Pin Mill were not, or the existing ones at Pin Mill were not currently lawful for a number of reasons. I asked the council to go away and provide to liaise with the necessary authorities and to come back with a written response, which they have now done. And Mr. Fisk has had the opportunity to look at that and come back with further very detailed comments on that, which I have now read. Having looked and carefully considered all this, I mean, ultimately, I think Mr. Fisk's position is that what is there at Pin Mill at the moment is not lawful. I've seen nothing from anybody else to corroborate that view. However, and this is a very important however, I'm not saying that that I'm not concluding that Mr. Fisk is wrong or that councils are right. But either way, it is ultimately it's not my role or it's not my responsibility, and it's not within my jurisdiction to determine whether or not what is at Pin Mill at the moment is lawful. Clearly, if existing development at Pin Mill were to be shown to be unlawful, then that would probably make undeliverable and inappropriate an allocation or a designation of Pin Mill as a boat mooring. But we're not at that stage at the moment. But as I say, it is not. I can't determine whether or not what is there is lawful. That is for other authorities to determine, and probably ultimately the courts to determine. So, for that reason, I don't think there's point in debating that particular point further. And my advice to Mr. Fisk basically is, I think if you are convinced yourself that there is a problem with lawfulness of what is a Pin Mill, you need to follow that up with the appropriate authorities. The council may be part of that, along with the Environment Agency and whoever else, and ultimately it would be a matter for the courts. You've got some breathing space in terms of you don't have to worry that this policy designating this as a mooring is going to be adopted, within a matter of weeks or months, because it isn't. It is probably at least a year away. So you've got some time to go away and do that work. And if in doing that work you manage to prove the point that that these aren't lawful, that obviously puts what's currently in the plan in a very different light. But I have to emphasize again, it's not my job it cannot be my role to decide what is when something is currently there, whether it's lawful or not. There are whole other regimes of the law to deal with that. I'll come to you in a second, Mr. Fisk, but I just want to sort of finish my points on this. So that brings us back to the plan and how it meets the need for what is currently identified as a need for 10 additional moorings in Baber. I won't repeat what I've said about the needs assessment, but obviously that also applies to that figure, because that comes from the same, that need for 10 moorings comes from the same needs assessment. So obviously all that applies in relation to what we've just talked about in the need assessment also applies to that figure. But what I would want to assure is that the council then considers whether it has identified currently, assuming the figure as cited by the council on whatever needs assessment it is at the time that the council comes back, is the 10 or more, or whatever it is, that the plan can accommodate that. My understanding, I come back, notwithstanding what I've said about the lawfulness of Pin Mill, the council currently contend that Pin Mill is lawful. I can't determine that, but I understand that on the council's basis that can accommodate 28 moorings. It's got permission for 20, I think, at the moment, and 3 others are deemed lawful, so that's 23. I make it. So my conclusion on that is that could accommodate 5 additional moorings at the moment. Is that, Mr. Hobbs? I don't know. Is Mr. Hobbs? Is that calculation correct or incorrect, or do you need to go away and consider it?
So I think it may be Mr. Doyle can
Oh,
comment
right.
slightly further, but the point is the arithmetic you've given is correct, but
Right.
it's possibly a little bit more nuanced than that, which is why I might then just ask Mr. Doyle if he can comment on whether the ceiling, bearing in mind the caveats that you just indicated, that you're not being drawn on the legal position, but on the council's assumptions about the legal position, just to comment on whether the ceiling is 5 or whether there is potentially scope for more than 5 through the way that that site is organised or laid out. So if Mr. Doyle can perhaps just provide a bit of picture on that.
Well, actually, if I can stop Mr. Doyle there, only on the basis that, as again, I don't, we don't really need to get into that. I suppose all the point at this stage, we'll need to get in that down the line when you've satisfied yourselves, type of thing. I just hear the point that you say, actually, it is 5 potentially, but it could potentially be more. So I hear that point. So
right.
I will.
Well,
I'll let you.
That's all we really wanted to say.
Yeah, I hear that point, and I'll let you then decide to come up with what evidence to what your position on that is. So that's fine. There was just one other sort of factual query that I had, just so I can understand the issue for now and going on. So LP 10 part 1 says, let me just get it in front of me, just so I can make sure I'm reading it correctly. Right, so LP 10, I think it's part 2, requires that there's no adverse effect of any mooring on the Stour and Orwell SPA and Ramsar and the Suffolk Coast and Heath AOMB, right? So that says that, which is entirely appropriate. And may limit what can be delivered, therefore, within what can be accommodated within those areas. I just wondered, so my point in that is does that cover all rivers and potential moorings? I mean, obviously it doesn't cover all waterways within the 2 districts, but does that in effect cover where people could realistically moor a boat, or are there other places outside the SPA and Ramsar which could, in theory, accommodate a boat? Is there somewhere else for people to go, or is that the whole of it? That's what all I was wondering. And again, I only really need to, well, it's just for my understanding at this stage, really. Obviously, you need to go away and consider that. But do you know off the top of your head, is there somewhere else that people could go?
I think that factual question is probably either for Mr. Hobbs or for Mr. Doyle. Because certainly my geography is not sufficiently good to answer that question.
Right. It probably comes down to depths of water and widths of waterways at various points. But in broad terms, is that something? Mr. Doyle, are you able to help us?
I'm not aware of anywhere actually that isn't covered by those designations, but Mr. Hobbs might know somewhere.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I think Mr. does answer that appropriately.
Right. Okay. So in effect, probably what that's saying, the reality is, I mean, this is again for your consideration in trying to identify sites to meet the need, if you can, subject to constraints type of thing, which is obviously a thing that if you can't meet it subject to constraints, and then there's a whole other avenues of things to explore. But I think that's important for you to be aware of, that there isn't anywhere else, there probably isn't anywhere else that is outside these areas that you've identified as a significant constraint. So I suppose that's all I'm saying, is you need to be mindful of that. Yeah. But I mean, obviously that's not a conclusive point, because you may go away and look and come back and say, oh, but actually we have found there is somewhere else, and that's fine. Okay. Mr. Fisk.
Is that live now, please?
It is. Yes, you are.
I think. Well, can I just raise a point? You said there's no corroboration. Can I draw your attention to the letter that has been published on the website from Mr. Saunders, which wholly corroborates my statements that mooring houseboats in the River Orwell is completely illegal.
Okay.
Plus that letter, I've mentioned probably 6 or more decisions of the court that declare it's illegal. And of course, there's also the appeal of Ipswich, that Ipswich lost, that supported the case that no houseboats can moor in the river. And the other issue is, of course, that nobody's mentioned, for the past 15 years, Bayberg have been talking about the mooring of houseboats. Not a single houseboat is moored in that plot. None of the vessels there are houseboats. To be a houseboat in law, and there are a multitude of decisions on this, to be a houseboat in law, it must be able to navigate the river, to carry goods and passengers in the river. If it doesn't do that, it's not a houseboat. It's not a boat, and it's not a vessel. Now that's well proven and well stated by the courts. None of those vessels on that site are other than chattels, classed the same as caravans. They have no authority to discharge sewage into the river. The river is fouled, it's unfit for purpose, it's a highly conservation area. Bayberg Council ignores all the laws relating to conservation and to the river. The corroboration is in all the judgments and all the statements of the courts.
Okay.
Can I just also add that currently there are investigations going on into the lawfulness of it by the police and by my MP. I'm attempting to get a public inspection or public. Sorry, I forgot the words now.
Yeah, that's okay, and that's a very fair point you make, Mr. Fisk. And I shouldn't have used the word. I shouldn't have said that there is nothing that corroborates it. So I do withdraw that. The fundamental point comes down to the fact that it is not my role to determine whether or not they are lawful. You mentioned that you're already in contact with your police, with the police and your MP about it, and I think that's the appropriate course that you need to take. I can't take this matter any further for you at the moment. If you go through those points, and the courts ultimately determine that these are unlawful, then that's the point at which it becomes a relevant matter for me. So thank you for that. And as I say, I withdraw my comment that the point hasn't been corroborated. Okay.
Thank you for that. I'll just make the point that the policy LB10 can hardly be sound because every item in it is totally illegal. And if it's approved, that's approving an illegal act.
Okay.
At the moment.
I hear you. I hear your comment. Thank you very much. Mr. Carruthers.
It's basically a very short comment. I'm aware of the fact that, because it goes back to the RRR.
Oh, you've accidentally put your mute back on.
Yeah, it's a short comment. It's basically goes back to the RRR report. In Beccles, there are 20 houseboats occupied by people who are homeless, and they aren't identified in the RRR report. They can't moor because it costs £25 a day to moor on the moorings, so they tend to be along the riverbank. My understanding is that that's similar throughout most of the eastern region, because you can buy an old cruiser hull for around about £500, and people are converting them into living accommodation. It's going on quite a lot more than is identified in the survey work. That's the only point I wanted to make.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Well, as I say, the current identified need of 10, as I say, all that I said in relation to the need for gypsies and travellers also needs to be considered in relation to that. So no doubt the council will have regard to what you've just said there, Mr. Carruthers. Right. Is there anything the council wants to say and comment? Only if you need to, or you understand. You understand.
No, so we've obviously listened to what's been said by the various contributions. We've obviously heard what you said. Clearly, there are things there for us to take away, reflect on, and then engage with various people as appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions. Since we're on the live stream anyway, and maybe other people hearing, thank everybody for their contributions throughout this stage of the hearings up until this point. I'd also like to thank the council for their cooperation and their helpful responses. And also particularly like to thank Annette once again, the programme officer. Annette, once again, without her, none of the hearings would have been possible. So just particularly like to thank her.
So we would certainly endorse those comments, particularly the comments directed to the sterling work being undertaken by the programme officer.
Okay, thank you very much. No doubt I will have contact with most of you, if not all of you, again in due course. Okay, thank you very much.